Hello, Paul Sabo with GospelProof.com. The video you're about to watch is part of a playlist our channel's been working on. I'd like to invite you to, suggest you start with part 1. The playlist is called Spiritual Warfare, and we'll see we're on part 5 now. I suggest you start out with part 1 and work your way through. It'll help you understand where we're coming through with the video. But if there's something in this video that caught your eye and you just want to continue watching, that's fine as well. Maybe you can catch up later. So, either way, on with the show. Hello, Paul Sabo, Christian evangelist and creator of GospelProof.com. I want to thank you for checking out, stopping in by the channel. We're now continuing our playlist we've been working on with spiritual warfare. As we continue, I've been putting a lot of time into this. As you can tell, when I'm not in between videos, I'm putting a lot of time into putting this all together. And some of you that are used to a lot of the parts of the Bible we're going to be talking about today, that's fine, but hopefully you can maybe look at them in a different way as we relate them to the spiritual warfare that we've been working on. As we left off in the last video, we were talking about false gods, how God had taken his special nation, which was to be the Hebrew Israelites, and he was working with them, but in the meantime, the Gentile nations were all covered with false gods. Well, in today's video, we're going to work with the same timeline. On that video, we were working on the timeline of the after the flood, which was the Judaical dispensation, which took us to the end of the Old Testament, right up to where Jesus died on the cross. We're still talking about that same time period. The way it was going, it would look like the majority of the world was to be following Satan. But as we know in today's world, Christianity is the most popular religion, and we want to see what did God do to change everything over to where it didn't end up going bad again like it was starting to before the flood. And as we look, one of the parts of the Bible I always think about is look at the book of Jonah. Now, before the time of Jesus, the book of Jonah, I suggest you read that. It's only 3 chapters. Jonah was a prophet of God's, and he went to Nineveh, which was a very evil town. God sent Jonah there to tell them that they had to change or he was going to destruct Nineveh. Well, he told them they had 40 days. Jonah didn't even want to go. He had to be talked into going, basically. It's another story in the Bible you have to read, but persuaded, we'll say, from God to go. But he ended up going, and just from Jonah telling them, from being Israelites' prophet and telling Nineveh that they had 40 days or God was going to overturn Nineveh, they changed in 40 days, and they did it just from hearing that. Now, we're going to look at what happened during the Bible to make it go from most of the world being following false gods. How did it go from that to where one of Israelites' prophets would walk into one of the most evil areas and they would change because one of the Israelites' prophets said that the real God was going to destruct if they didn't, and they listened. So, and as we know in today's world, Christianity is one of the largest religions. So we're going to look at some events that the power of God, how God overpowered what Satan was doing with these false gods and false religions throughout the nations and got it to where we are today. Right off the start, when he started the nation of Israel, it started with Abraham. Abraham's nephew Lot ended up going to Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, I'm not sure if you're familiar with that story, but Sodom and Gomorrah was a totally wicked town. I mean, it's medieval wickedness in sexual rape, just Horrible. Let's put it this way. There's no way, if God didn't put judgment on this area, that we would have the world we have today if these people would have moved on. So, to start things off, God totally destructed and burnt down with sulfur Sodom and Gomorrah. And I'm sure the world got word of that to start things moving along. But we're going to move on and start off by looking at how God took care of the false god Baal. We're going to take a look at 1 Kings chapter 18. Now, as we know, as I've said, during this period, a lot of the Israelites were starting to follow these false gods outside of the real God, who they called Yahweh. Well, this has to do with a period during the king Ahab. Ahab was known as one of Israelites' worst kings. He was the seventh king of the Israelites. Now, during the reign of Ahab, he had it actually set up to where Baal worship was taken on and equal to Yahweh worship of the real God throughout the Israelites. Well, God put an end to this. We're going to take a look at it. What God did was he took Elijah, who was his one prophet, and he put him up against Baal, had 450 false prophets following him. Well, Elijah took and gathered the 450 prophets in front of the Israelites, and he kind of put it in a duel, went up against them. He told them to get 2 bullocks, for them to take one and he'll take the other, and for them to set it up on wood as to burn a sacrifice, and he'd do the same. And he said, you have your God start your fire, and I'll have our God start our fire. And they sat and they waited. They waited all day. These 450 prophets worshiped Baal and kept trying to get Baal to light this fire. Never did happen. Finally, it was time for Elijah. Elijah steps up. He tells some of the Israelites, go get some water. He said, douse that wood with water. He had them do it 3 times. There was a creek next to it. Fill it up with water. It was sitting in water. And then he talked to the real God. We're going to take a look at this in 1 Kings chapter 18, verses 37 through 39. Elijah says, hear me, O Lord, hear me, that the people may know that thou art the real Lord God, and that thou hast turned their heart back again. Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt sacrifice. And when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces, and they said, the Lord, he is the God. The Lord, he is the God. Then, as you know, false prophets were to be sentenced to death, so they were obviously made to be false prophets. They ended up taking them down to the creek, and the 450 prophets of Baal were killed. But as you could tell, this word I'm sure got about to a lot of the other Baal followers and made him look bad. Now, we talked in the last video about how God, in dealing with the Israelites, how he rescued them from slavery out of Egypt while they were Pharaoh was king over there. Well, as you know, God put many plagues. There was 10 plagues he put on Egypt before Pharaoh would let the Israelites leave. Well, like I said in the last video, each of those plagues was to make one of Pharaoh's had many false gods. Each of those plagues was to make one of their gods look bad. There was nothing their gods could do to stop each of these plagues from happening. And then in the end, we saw after Pharaoh finally let the Israelites leave, that was when there was the Red Sea crossing. After they left, Pharaoh changed his mind and he stormed after them with all his whole army. Well, Israelites come up to the Red Sea. That's where God parted the sea for the Israelites to cross. And then after Pharaoh's army went into the Red Sea, God destructed their army by letting the water come back and going over their army. And I want to say on this, you can see this in, if you look at gospelproof.com, I have the Bible proof section. You'll see a couple areas here. This is one of them that Ron Wyatt, he found a lot of these things I'm going to talk about. He found the actual places that it happened, and like he found wheels and stuff in the Red Sea where this happened and stuff like that. Check that out on gospelproof.com. I just want to throw that in there. But you could tell how Egypt was a large nation, and I'm sure word got around on the real God doing this over in Egypt. We'll close this by reading Exodus chapter 14, verse 18. It says, "And the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord, when I have gotten the honor upon Pharaoh, upon his chariots, and upon his horsemen." Now, after the Egypt were free from slavery, they traveled around for 40 years in the deserts before they went into their promised land. Now, God had them build an Ark of the Covenant. Now, the Ark of the Covenant was a resemblance of God's throne that he has in heaven. And the Israelites, as they traveled around, they would carry this ark, and it had a mercy seat on top where the real God was called the invisible God. As you saw them carrying this around, you would see a seat where the invisible God would be supposedly sitting up there. So people would see Israelite traveling with their God. This here, I want to talk about how they used this in one of their battles. Has to do with Jericho. Before they went into the promised land, Jericho was a nation near the promised land that had a great wall around it where nobody could get in. Well, what the Israelites did, what God told them to do, was for 6 days they traveled around Jericho one time a day with the Ark of the Covenant. And then on the 7th day, they went around 7 times. And after going around 7 times, the trumpet blew, and they all shouted, and God took and brought down that wall, went falling down, and they were able to get in, and God put the people into their hand, and they wiped out the whole town of Jericho. Again, a word on stuff like this definitely got out. One of the reasons we know it got out was we're going to talk about an incident where people tried to take the Ark of the Covenant. We're going to take a look at 1 Samuel chapter 5. Now, the Philistines stole the Ark of the Covenant. Now, their god was Dagon. We heard about him. He was the god that had a fish head with the arms of a man. They had a statue of Dagon that they worshipped. Well, the Philistines, in 1 Samuel chapter 5, talks about how they stole the Ark of the Covenant. They bring it in, they put it in with their statue of Dagon to leave it for the night. They come out the next morning, Dagon was knocked over. They're like, didn't know. So they stood up their statue again. They come out the next morning, Dagon fell over again with his head knocked off and his arms knocked off. So when they stood him up again, there was nothing but a stub of their statue of Dagon there. So that gave them the point. They're like, we better get rid of this Ark of the Covenant. So they lived in Ashdod. So there were some other Philistines that lived in Gath. So they brought it over to their other part, Gash, and gave them the Ark of the Covenant. Well, the Ark of the Covenant, as it was there, people started getting sick, plagues started going all over the land. So they're like, oh no, we got to do something with this. So they got all the heads of Philistines together. They're like, we got to do something with this Ark of the Covenant because bad is coming to us. So they took and they brought it over to Ekron, were the Ekronites, and they gave it to the Ekronites. Well, the Ekronites get it, plagues start going all over their area. So the Ekronites are like, they got a hold of the Philistines and said, hey, give this back to its original owners because there ain't nothing but bad coming from us. And so we're going to take a look at how that closed in 1 Samuel chapter 5, verse 11. It says, so they got and gathered together all the lords of the Philistines and said, send away the ark of God to Israel, and let it go again to its own place, that it slay us and our people. For there was a deadly destruction throughout all the city. And then it says the hand of God was heavy there. So you can start to get a picture of how the surrounding nations were starting to get a taste of the real God and how he loved their nation of Israel and he was close with their people. Now, when the Israelites went into their promised land, their promised land wasn't just an empty land. Now, it was already taken over. There was already people, nations that lived in these areas. Well, what happened was God had them fight and take over all these nations. Now, to where they got their promised land, there was homes already built, furniture, livings, jewelry, everything already there for them. Now, in reading this, a lot of people that don't know the Bible well will try to talk bad of our God, saying how bad that was for him to do that and to kill all these people and stuff. Well, I always think of Romans 8:28, which says, all things work together for good to them that love God. You know, it's one of the things that the Bible is always teaching us, is that all things work towards good for a Christian, you know. And these nations, people need to understand how bad they were. They were so bad that you take today is one of the worst cities that we can come up with in the United States, anywhere. That's nothing to compare to how all these nations were. There's no way we could have a world as we had today if these nations weren't put judgment on. So you have to understand that when reading this. I mean, I know it seems people that don't know the Bible, they read, they're like, oh man, just killing all these people and all these people, it had to be dealt with. And in the meantime, God had a plan, and he was building his people, the Israel, and you see how it evolved into today's world. Today, you know, our world wouldn't be so peaceful if these people would have been allowed to live. There's no way. So you got to keep that in mind when reading the Bible. But understand that when he took these nations, that there was mass. I mean, there was like no Israelites would die, and they would just completely clean house in these areas. And so people saw that it was obvious that God was working with them. We're going to show one story in the Bible that will show you an example of this. We're going to take a look at with Gideon, what happened with Gideon in the book of Judges, chapter 7. Now, Gideon was one of the judges assigned by God. Now, Gideon was the last person to be a leader. For him to lead a nation, I mean, it was like he'd be the last person you would ever imagine. But that's why God picked him. And when Gideon, they took on the Midianites. When the people come together to help to fight the war with Gideon, 32,000 Israelites showed up. God said, no, that's too many. He kept whittling it down. He whittled it down to where finally there was only 300 men. He sent Gideon, who was the last person you think would be a leader, and with only 300 Israelites, and they completely took out all of the Midianites. Like I said, he did this so people would see that God was behind it, and he was putting these areas in their hand. So these nations, the people would understand that Israel did have the real God, and that he was in power. We're going to take a look at how this closed up in Judges chapter 7, verse 2. It says, and the Lord said unto Gideon, the people that are with thee are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hands, lest Israel wants himself against me, saying, mine own hands have saved me. See, he wanted Israel to realize that he was with them and he was doing it, and he wanted the surrounding nations to see that he was the one who did it, because how else could 300 men, without any losses, wipe out all the Midianites? So, see, stuff like this was happening to show the world that he was the real God. When it come time for Jesus' time to come around, you could see how all these people were familiar with the Israelites' God. Well, Jesus, you know, he performed a lot of miracles, and then by the time you could tell when Paul was to go around and start his Christian churches, people were to find out that Jesus was in fact the Israelites' regular God in human form, you know, so they knew of him. And so when they heard this, that's one of the reasons why the Christian churches were so successful. The basic part of this video I just wanted to show was how the power of the real God had come through, and how he made these false gods look stupid, basically, and to where the world knew and realized that he was the real God. And when it come time for them to have an opportunity to serve the real God, they wanted to. And as far as Satan and his angels go, you know, you need to realize that they only are very limited with power. Yeah, they can influence and stuff like that, but if you read Job, first chapter of Job, you see where Satan and the angels, all the angels, how it was times where they would come meet with God. They had to check in with God, and so God has control of everything. Always remember Romans 8:28 that all things work together for good for those who love God, and God gives us all free will, and with this free will, a lot of bad does happen, but God always finds a way to turn it towards good for those who love God and for our world today. Our world today would never be as peaceful as it is today if it wouldn't be for a lot of these bad destruction things that have happened. So we're going to move on from here. We're going to close out. We're going to move on. Next week, we're going to talk about Jesus. We're going to talk about the coming of Jesus, because we already talked about how in the beginning, how Satan overpowered and took out the first Adam, when gave us how that whole deal went down. Well, now Jesus is going to be the second Adam. So we want to go over that so that afterwards we can talk about how Satan comes back and works with today's religions, and we'll get on with that. So hopefully this has been a blessing to you. Hopefully you can understand how the real God is almighty and does hold the power. Paul Sable with GospelProof.com. Thanks for watching.